Dio Brando, a fundamental force within JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Having taken the main stage within a few parts and having influence over the original universe, Dio is a character that needs to be talked about. And sadly, through my YouTube career, I haven't really brought him up in a writing narrative kind of standpoint. As a YouTuber that likes to power scale his favorite characters, I feel like Dio's, time stopping and vampiric abilities were always outshining him within my own head. But I felt like personally as of late and, analyzing characters in my own free time, I feel like I need to talk about Dio as he's kind of the most important thing in JoJo's. On top of the fact that I don't think people see Dio as a person / character, they more or less see him as three individual parts with a little bit of influence over the entire franchise, which I think is genuinely wrong. I asked my community through the community tab what they thought of part 1 and part 3 Dio. Usually how it always turned out is either A, they liked part 1 Dio over part 3 Dio and then they gave an explanation, or they either said part 3 Dio over part 1 Dio and then gave an explanation. Sometimes I would maybe get a part 6 person in there, but genuinely it almost seems like people just don't see Dio as one character, but instead 3, which I think personally sucks. So with this video, I'm going to explain Dio himself and the ideas he comes with, since Araki actually made him pretty heavily layered, having ideas of nature versus nurture, what is happiness, what is power, what is humanity itself, and the largest of the topics, fate within JoJo's / how humans view fate. Well, intro aside, my name is Metas, and I welcome you to my Dio video. Entering into part 1 Phantom Blood, we get introduced to the Brandos, a family clearly in poverty and not in the best of states. A sick Dario Brando, the father of Dio Brando, would give Dio a last parting gift, a letter from the Joestars, as George Joestar owes Dario for an act of kindness. That was, of course, not an act of kindness, as it was petty theft that had led to their encounter. Dario then would proceed to ask Dio to become rich and famous thanks to the Joestar heritage, but this inheritance from his father would mean nothing to Dio. But he would see his father as nothing but scum on the earth. With the intro of Dio Brando, Araki's already setting up ideas of nature versus nurture. Dio clearly grows up in a rough neighborhood, thanks to at least the anime portion showing us a little bit more than the manga does. Clearly his family life is nothing but torture from what it looks like. His father is clearly an alcoholic, sells his dead wife's clothing for alcohol money. He clearly abuses his son. It is not a very good scenario for Dio. One might think that thanks to this influence around him, he might turn out bad, but as the story progresses on through part 1, we start to realize that maybe, just maybe, Dio is literally born pure evil. As Dio's literal thought process on meeting the Joestar's heir, Jonathan Joestar, is to psychologically torture him and then to eventually take his place as heir to the Joestar throne. He also, literally on first introduction, through basic writing criticisms, you can realize he is the villain. And true to Dio's word, he starts to literally break Jonathan down bit by bit, spreading rumors and lies about him, literally beating him to make him look less strong than he actually is, trying to one-up him in every way possible, trying to be the top dog in almost any scenario that you can think of. Dio will go as far as invading a woman's personal privacy to outcompete Jonathan. Now, there actually is a deeper theme with this one. With more classical villains, usually there is a theme of treating women and creatures and just lesser men as beneath them. In Dio's case, it's mostly women and animals, showing clear signs of having a power complex or a god complex over people. But thanks to Jonathan giving him an attitude adjustment, Dio now has to rethink his plans. He is now building up a relationship with Jonathan that he eventually will break. On the flip side of that is now slowly killing George Joestar like he did his father, Dario Brando. But of course, the goodest boy, Jonathan Joestar, figures this out, as now he's suspicious, thanks to the letter of Dario Brando, about Dio and what he is giving his father. Jonathan proceeds to go on a mission to find where this medicine comes from and defeat Dio, possibly putting him in jail. So what happens when you put a man's plan in jeopardy, putting him into a corner that he possibly can't get out of? Well, of course, Dio's literal first option is to use the stone mask to kill Jonathan, and second, go into a drunk stupor. Comparing himself to his father, Dio has reached rock bottom, but probably due to fate herself intervening, Dio now witnesses the power of the stone mask and makes a dastardly plan. Soon after, we get some very choice dialogue from Speedwagon of all people that I would like to point out. Speedwagon proceeds to have a mini monologue talking about villainy and the people he's met through his low-life life, and how Dio literally beats all of them. He's literally born evil since birth. And with future ideas of fate in later parts and how it works, this case might actually be right. Dio might not be the product of his environment, but might be the product of himself, going back to the idea of nature versus nurture. And it's definitely his nature, seeing his past actions of beating women, killing animals, trying to psychologically manipulate a family for wealth, and trying now to get a vampiric ability just for himself, just truly proves the point that he is just by nature truly and pure evil. Even comically looking at it, he's good looking, he psychologically manipulates people, he's charismatic, he's just the classical definition of a villain. Hell, his literal name translates to God. Like, how can you not, be a villain when you have all these traits and literally, forsake the name of God? And to add upon that religious idea, Dio has a lot of traits of some modern depictions of Satan just kind of being this suave, charismatic character. And him literally having the name of God, having all these evil and sinful traits, is just the ribbon on top. And then we get my favorite scene with Dio in it. Finally realizing the human limit, by rejecting it, you can transcend it. Literally, physically speaking, mind you. He then transforms into a creature of the night, an undead vampire. A monster with regenerative capabilities, having superhuman strength, having the powers to make ghouls, zombies, and vampires eventually, even in part 3. The ability to instantly freeze something with just a touch, and the powers to shoot out not literal laser beams, but pressurized water through his eyes, with the ability to hypnotize people. Dio, in my personal opinion, isn't a vampire. He has now become something more than that, an unholy monster of abilities far beyond the power of humanity, at least during this time period. Of course, a fight would break out, Jonathan versus Dio, and luckily, Jonathan would come out barely alive, but so would Dio, leading to another encounter in the near future. Now, with his time by himself, Dio would lick his wounds, slowly over time just eating people to regain his strength. On top of that, slowly growing an army. And of course, with a power boost like this, his ego, his god complex, everything about him increases dramatically. Dio now has truly reached the pinnacle of what his evil could reach. His plan now being to rule over all of humanity, being number one at top of everybody else. This fact is cemented by the fact that he makes a mother become a creature of the undead to eventually eat. You know what, I'm not gonna say it, I don't want to get demonetized. Dio's fucked up, like really bad after becoming a vampire. Like, he's full-blown crazy now. But this is a hero story, and of course Jonathan has to come to the rescue and save the day. The final battle would ensue, Jonathan and Dio just going at it in an all-out brawl. Jonathan, at least narratively speaking, is the complete and total opposite to Dio. Jonathan never lied to get to his power. He trained to get to his power. He never, manipulated anybody to, achieve some type of greater goal greater than himself. Jonathan is literally, and I think in its entirety out of all the Joestars, is the most pure out of all of them, and successfully does defeat Dio. But by chance of luck, or maybe even fate intervening, Dio's minion would of course find Dio's severed head, and a new plan would arise. You see, up until this point, Dio truly thought himself above all of humanity. Every single buddy, every single person on the planet, every single creature. Dio truly thought he was the pinnacle of the earth. In defeat, he realizes character growth within himself, as he now kind of almost reveals to Jonathan, basically, that he admires him. He admires his courageous power, his spirit, and especially his body, as, Dio doesn't have one now. Dio, in a weird sense of thinking, thinks that if God or fate does exist, the fact that two people that transcend humanity shouldn't exist, and since Dio needs a body, he wants Jonathan, as now he'll be kind of whole or one person now, which is a really weird and morbid thought process, but I kinda get it where he's coming from. A person who wants to rule over humanity with an iron fist and transcend everybody, there can't be two people that transcend humanity. And while Dio has attacked Jonathan and Erina during their honeymoon, a fight of course does break out, and surprisingly enough, Dio technically wins. Now I know some people are gonna argue with this fact, so let me explain. Not only did Dio take Jonathan's body after Jonathan died to his injuries on the boat, he technically became the sole heir to the Joestar throne. During part 1, he transcended humanity, technically winning, I guess, or at least achieved his goals, at least in a loose way, if we take early part 1's Dio's, approach approach on life. He transcends humanity so much that the fact that future Joestars would have to feel his, spiritual vengeance, I guess is what I would like to call it. A quote from Part 3 Joseph: "Despite being our first time meeting, I feel like I've known him forever. Actually, that feeling holds true. After all, I've known him since before I was born." In Part 2 Battle Tendency, there is a heavy emphasis on what Dio has done to the Joestar family. Joseph doesn't have a father figure. George dies because of Dio's henchmen. Lisa doesn't have a husband anymore. That also goes with Ariana losing Jonathan to Dio. Overall, the family, technically only being Ariana in this case, hates Hamon and vampires and the lifestyle that is now betrothed onto her. Even though Dio is now in his Atlantic watery grave, still has influence over the family. Dio, at least in my interpretation of reading Part 1 and Part 2 to a degree, did win. He did achieve his goals that he set up earlier in life. He did become an all-powerful being that transcends humanity and did obtain the body of his longtime rival, on top of the fact of ruining the Joestar family. The only downside, he has to think to himself for 100 years on the bottom of the seafloor. To be honest, it doesn't seem that crazy for an immortal being. 4 years before the events of Stardust Crusaders, Dio's coffin is found, and he is within that said coffin. He proceeds to eat the people on board this ship that have found him, and now he is let loose upon the world near the Canary Islands in the Atlantic Ocean. Being at the bottom of the sea for 100 years, an idea must have sprung up within Dio's head. The ideas of heaven and peace of mind. Fate is a very large factor within JoJo's, and definitely after Part 1. And it's even having thematic themes in that part as well. Fate is everywhere in JoJo's, and the fact that Dio is one of the people that tries to at least overcome it, or at least accepts it. The reasoning to this, as it's not actually totally random, is because of his near-death experiences and what has happened to him in his life. Most likely his childhood experiences, the near-death scenarios he's had with Jonathan, and being trapped underneath the sea for 100 years. For a second there, you can assume, being at the bottom of the sea floor for that many years, that he felt mortal in a way. Or at least bare minimum, had a change of mind, a change of attitude and personality. So what does he do for 4 years without anybody stopping him? Well, it's actually fairly long, but not too complicated. At bare minimum, with at least these early 4 years, he just probably eats a lot, trying to regain his strength since, Jonathan's body is still filled with Hamon and it is not optimal for him yet. At some point, he does get at least strong enough to move on forward, and at some point meets Enya the Hag. She would then acquire the stand arrows and lead a young Diavolo down a path somewhere in Italy. Around that time, Dio should be using Jonathan's body very recklessly, having children all across the world, one of them being Giorno and Dio's children, of course. He would then gain the world about 6 months before the events of Stardust Crusaders, or at least time stop at bare minimum. And then he would eventually meet Enrico Pucci, a person that he would very much admire, who he would discuss about ideas of heaven and fate to him, on top of ideas of philosophy and other things. And the last thing about this 4-year period that we would know about was him trying to find somebody that could revive his dead body for the heaven plan. During these 4 years, I can safely say this for sure. Dio is a nihilist now. Having ideas at least explained in Part 6 say that, he's trying to find happiness, and the only way you can have happiness is not worrying about future actions that are going to happen to you. And the only way to make you happy is to know your fate, to have peace of mind. Dio would also come up with ideas of gravity and how people will just kind of orbit to each other for some fated reason of some kind. An example of this would be Pucci in general with his backstory and how he eventually would become friends with Dio himself. Hell, technically, you could almost view Pucci as just another version of Dio, as he basically holds up to his standards of what he wanted, since both want humanity to overcome destiny itself. But, the downside of that being both Pucci and Dio would control destiny, quote unquote, which is kind of a bad thing. But I'll talk about that later in the video. For right now, let's finally talk about Part 3, Stardust Crusaders. So when it comes to Part 3 Dio, almost on an introduction scale, he's kind of almost built up nostalgically, like, oh shit, Dio's back, shit's about to get real kind of vibe to it. And when Dio has his own monologues to himself, they actually sound pretty dark and menacing, as he's just kind of reminiscing about the past and how he's going to conquer, the future and his fate. But there's a sense of suave and elegance to it, like he's aged like fine wine. But he's still up to his old tricks, trying to manipulate people like Avdol, of course. So he's still up to his old BS, but there's a sense of refinement to it, I guess, is what I would like to say. And even though he has very few appearances outside of his final battle, I think he's still done extremely well. There's this sense of mystery and mythic sense that's around him. It's actually pretty cool. There's an aura of experience, and he even has a few dialogue moments where it's like, nah, you're not supposed to, challenge the Joestars very hastily. You're not supposed to go crazy here. There's a sense of experience now with Dio that I feel like is done extremely well, which makes sense. You spend 100 years at the bottom of the ocean, you're gonna have a few new ideas. I at least hope so. And a good example of this would, of course, be the Whole Horse interaction with Dio. The entire time, Whole Horse is monologuing to himself and how Dio is just this intimidating creature of the night who doesn't try to be intimidating, he just kind of is. And when he tries to challenge Dio's authority, he shows off the world for one of the very few times we do get to see before its actual introduction, kind of building up the hype factor for the ending fight in part 3. Another thing about part 3 Dio is that he's gained followers. These people aren't vampires or ghouls or really any monstrous creatures. These are real people. It's borderline almost cultish how they like Dio. An example of that would be Vanilla Ice. Vanilla Ice would sacrifice himself with his own stand to give blood or slash his body to Dio. Now note, stands shouldn't be able to kill their own users. It's part of kind of like their rules, quote unquote. Stands will not harm their user. They'll actually try to actively protect them. So the fact that Cream will just yeet off Vanilla Ice's head is kind of crazy and just shows how much love and devotion that Vanilla Ice has towards Dio. But the next greatest reveal happens with Polnareff's encounter with Dio and the introduction to the time-stopping stand, the world. Now, of course, I've already made an in-depth power scaling video on the world in the past, but for this video, I think I'm actually going to more talk about kind of the meaning of the world, its tarot card meaning, and kind of its influence from, rock music legend Dio. The meaning of the world goes as follows. The world represents an ending to a cycle of life, a pause in life before the next big cycle, beginning with the Fool. It is an indicator of major and inexorable change, of tectonic breath, or the reversed world, mourn the loss of what could have been, and honor the shock and disappointment you are experiencing. There is a lot of meaning here with the world. The regular tarot card meaning could be a lot of stuff. Dio trying to change, his cycle of life. Maybe it's a representation of the Joestars trying to defeat Dio. Or it could be hinting at a deeper meaning with heaven, possibly with Dio, and his pursuit of that heaven. Or it could be maybe a reflection of Dio looking at himself and how he can't control his own fate. And when it comes to design aspects and how the world actually looks, of course, it's a immediate and direct callback to Ronnie James's Dio's Holy Diver and the Star song Holy Diver. And right after the reveal of the world, we finally enter the final battle with Dio. And almost near immediately, we see one thing that carries over from part 1. He does not care about people whatsoever. He genuinely still sees himself above humanity, which I just kind of like the little callback to. But when it comes to the actual fight, I feel like this is where Dio really truly shines. He's an absolute and unstoppable monster. He literally just starts blowing away attacks like they're actually nothing without his stand. And when he does use it, he uses it effectively here. This is possibly one of the greatest introductions to an ability ever. He literally just stops time, moves closer to Kakyoin, and just donuts him immediately. Then proceeds to tell Joseph, hey, I'm gonna drink you later, cause I want my full powers back. Just casually, just like a badass. It's even semi-implied that Dio is not running on full efficient power here, as time stop can actually grow on exponentially. It's hinted at in an interview that if he was never defeated, he would eventually stop time almost permanently, quote unquote. The Dio we're seeing now in terms of power and fear is much greater than the part 1 Dio we previously saw. There's this sense of arrogance and pride about Dio in this fight that actually, works because he has the power to back it up. He, at this point, at least personally speaking, has truly transcended above humanity, literally spiritually now and physically. Dio has clearly went through enough past history to now realize his mistakes and of course get stronger from them. Of course, coming up with new philosophies like heaven, peace of mind, and how he can truly accomplish this by getting rid of the Joestar bloodline. With them out of the way, he can truly achieve his piece of heaven. But probably due to him interfering with the Joestar bloodline is probably what led to his eventual defeat, as stand lore and stand history, or just how stands work in general, is weird, and the fact that Star Platinum, the world, is even a thing is probably because, Dio tampered with things he shouldn't have. I guess stabbing your new body that used to belong to your enemy's grandfather and getting weird powers from it probably wasn't the best idea in hindsight, right? Sadly, this is where Dio fails, and of course passes on. But it's not where his influence ends. Of course, we move on to part 6, Stone Ocean. The Dio we eventually come to see in part 6 is a lot more calmer. He's not thirsting for power, he's just talking. like a normal person, I guess, or maybe like a normal undead vampire in this scenario, I guess. But he just seems not weird. He's friendlier, I would guess, is the most key word I can use here when interacting with Poochie. Sometime during part 6, we eventually learn that Dio needs a friend for his heaven plan, and what that entails is that he needs a close friend that's not a follower, which vaguely implies somebody better than Jonathan, somebody that he views as an equal, or just somebody he doesn't need to challenge constantly on a daily basis. And of course, Poochie would fit that qualification. Of course, Dio would test him from time to time to see if he was actually the true thing, and apparently it was. Poochie was truly that friend he needed for this plan. With Jonathan, he treated him with respect at the end of their fight, and with Poochie, he just treated him normally, like he deserved that respect, which I think really is trying to poke at Dio's character from at least all the way back in part 1. But Dio would die before he had the ability to achieve heaven, but thanks to Poochie and his tenacity, he would eventually achieve heaven for Dio, as was originally planned. So, what is heaven? Heaven is happiness, and in order for humans to attain heaven, they need to overcome their destiny. By following a very obscure ritual process, one can obtain a heaven stand, quote unquote, and would have the power to eventually let people see their own fates. Once they come to terms with realizing their fates and their lives continuing on forward from that present moment, they can achieve true happiness. This was the goal of both Poochie and Dio. But the problem is once you obtain this heaven stand, you are technically above fate and be able to manipulate it. So imagine giving Dio, the narcissistic, nihilistic, power-hungry, god complex character that he is, the ability to manipulate other people's fates and his own. You would have a being so powerful, they would be over heaven itself. Dio as a being has lived over 100 plus years and has gone through a lot of life-changing experiences over a very long time. Seeing him as 3 individual characters is a dishonor and disrespect to his character, as it slowly evolves and changes over time like a character naturally should progress as. Storylines do not change just because a part does. Of course, there is a grand arc to everything within any series. Dio himself should be a prime example of that, going from a power-hungry 12-year-old to a very thoughtful individual looking for something greater than himself, who just wants a piece of heaven or happiness, with very complex villainous themes laid out through multiple parts in his own franchise. Well, that's going to be the end of the video. Like, comment, share, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, StrayHydrogen. I'll see you in the next one, ladies and gentlemen.